In fact, do they go now? They seem to be slipping, if you will read carefully, for instance, the words of Mr. Bayard Rustin, towards some sort of a Procrustean formulation which ends up less urging the advancement of the Negro than the regression of the white people. 14 times as many people in New York City born of Negroes are illegitimate as of whites. This is a problem. How shall we address it? By seeking out laws that encourage illegitimacy in white people? This, unfortunately, tends to be the rhetorical momentum that some of their arguments are taking.
One thing you might do, Mr. Buckley, is let them vote in Mississippi.
I agree. I agree. I couldn't agree with you more, and for... except, lest I appear too ingratiating, which is hardly my objective here tonight, I think actually what is wrong in Mississippi, sir, is not that not enough Negroes are voting, but that too many white people are voting.
In 1965, at the height of the civil rights movement, the Cambridge Union in England hosted a historic debate that would come to symbolize the ideological struggle over race and equality in America. The motion under discussion was, "The American dream is at the expense of the American Negro." On one side stood James Baldwin, a prolific writer and civil rights advocate, whose works eloquently exposed the deep racial injustices embedded in American society. Opposing him was William F. Buckley, Jr., a staunch conservative intellectual and founder of National Review, who sought to defend America's institutions and argue against the idea that black Americans were systematically oppressed. The debate took place before an audience of Cambridge students, a setting known for its rigorous intellectual discourse. It was a rare moment where the struggle for racial justice in America was examined on an international stage, far removed from the battlegrounds of the American South. Baldwin, drawing from his lived experiences and historical realities, delivered an impassioned speech that was met with thunderous applause.
I'm standing and applauding this magnificent speech of James Baldwin.
Buckley, in contrast, leaned on rhetorical flourishes, conservative ideology, and a vision of America that sought to downplay the systemic nature of racial discrimination. By the end of the debate, the audience overwhelmingly voted in favor of Baldwin's argument, affirming that the American dream had indeed been built at the expense of black Americans. However, Buckley's speech remained significant, as it encapsulated a form of conservative resistance to civil rights that persists in various forms to this day. His arguments, full of contradictions and strategic deflections, offer a window into the ways in which defenders of the status quo attempt to minimize the realities of racial injustice while upholding narratives of American exceptionalism. Now, let's dive into his speech to come back with an in-depth analysis of the same at the end of the video.
That of all the indictments Mr. Baldwin has made of America, here tonight and in his copious literature of protest, the one that is most striking involves, in effect, the refusal of the American community to treat him other than as a Negro. The American community has refused to do this. The American community, almost everywhere he goes, treats him with the kind of unction, the kind of satisfaction at posturing carefully for his flagellations of our civilization, that indeed, quite properly, commands the contempt which he so eloquently showers upon us. It is impossible, in my judgment, to deal with the indictment of Mr. Baldwin unless one is prepared to deal with him as a white man. Unless one is prepared to say to him, the fact that your skin is black is utterly irrelevant to the arguments that you raise. The fact that you sit here, as is your rhetorical device, and lay the entire weight of the Negro ordeal on your own shoulders is irrelevant to the argument that we are here to discuss. The gravamen of Mr. Baldwin's charges against America are not so much that our civilization has failed him and his people, that our ideals are insufficient, but that we have no ideals. That our ideals rather are some sort of a superficial coating which we come up with at any given moment in order to justify whatever commercial and noxious experiment we are engaged in. Thus, Mr. Baldwin can write his book, The Fire Next Time, in which he threatens America. He didn't, in writing that book, speak with the British accents that he used exclusively tonight, in which he threatened America with the necessity for us to jettison our entire civilization. The only thing that the white man has that the Negro should want, he said, is power. And he is treated from coast to coast in the United States with a kind of unctuous
doesn't choose to give way. The interrupter must, and he has done. The interrupter is now set down.
Goes beyond anything that was ever expected from the most servile Negro creature by a Southern family. I propose to pay him the honor this night of saying to him, Mr. Baldwin, I am going to speak to you without any reference whatever to those surrounding protections which you are used to in virtue of the fact that you are a Negro. And here we need to ask the question, what in fact shall we do about it, Mr. President? What shall we in America try to do, for instance, to eliminate those psychic humiliations which I join Mr. Baldwin in believing are the very worst aspects of this discrimination? You found it a source of considerable mirth to laugh away the statistics of my colleague, Mr. Burford. I don't think they are insignificant. They are certainly not insignificant in a world which attaches a considerable importance to material progress. It is, in fact, the case that 7/10 of the white income of the United States is equal to the income that is made by the average Negro. I don't think this is an irrelevant statistic, ladies and gentlemen. It takes a capitalization of $15,000, $16,000, $17,000 per job in the United States. This is a capitalization that was not created exclusively as a result of Negro travail. My great-grandparents worked too. Presumably yours worked also. I don't know of anything that has ever been created without the expense of something. All of you who hope for a diploma here are going to do that at the expense of a considerable amount of effort. And I would thank you, please not to belie the fact that a considerable amount of effort went into the production of a system which grants a greater degree of material well-being to the American Negro than that is enjoyed by 95% of the other peoples of the human race. But even so, to the extent that your withering laughter suggested here that you found this a contemptible observation, I agree. I don't think it matters that there are 35 millionaires among the Negro community. If there were 20 million millionaires among the Negro community of the United States, I would still agree with you that we have a dastardly situation. But I'm asking you not to make politics as the crow flies, to use the fleeted phrase of Professor Oakeshott, but rather to consider what, in fact, is it that we Americans ought to do? What are your instructions that I'm to take back to the United States, my friend? I want to know what it is that we should do, and especially I want to know whether it is time, in fact, to abandon the American dream as it has been defined by Mr. Haycock and Mr. Burford. What, in fact, is it that we ought to do, for instance, to avoid two humiliations mentioned by Mr. Baldwin as being a part of his own experience during his lifetime. At the age of 12, you will find on reading his book, he trespassed outside the ghetto of Harlem and was taken by the scruff of the neck by a policeman on 42nd Street and Madison Avenue and said, "Here, you nigger, go back to where you belong." 15, 20 years later, he goes in and asks for a Scotch whiskey at the airport at Chicago and is told by the white barman that he is obviously underage and under the circumstances cannot be served. I know from your faces that you share with me the feeling of compassion and the feeling of outrage that this kind of thing should have happened. What, in fact, are we going to do to this policeman? And what, in fact, are we going to do to this Borman? How are we going to avoid the kind of humiliations that are perpetually visited on members of a minority race? Obviously, the first element is concern. We've got to care that it happens. We have got to do what we can to change the warp and woof of moral thought in society in such fashion as to try to make it happen less and less. Let me urge this point to you, which I can do with authority, my friends, the only thing that I can tonight. And that is to tell you that in the United States, there is a concern for the Negro problem. Now, if you get up to me and say... if you get up to me and say, well, now, is there the kind of concern that we, students of Cambridge, would show if the problem were our own, all I can say is I don't know. It may very well be that there has been some sort of a sunburst of moral enlightenment that has hit this community, so as to make it predictable that if you were the governors of the United States, the situation would change overnight. I'm prepared to grant this as a form of courtesy, Mr. President. But meanwhile, I am saying to you that the engines of concern in the United States are working. The presence of Mr. Baldwin here tonight is in part a reflection of that concern. You cannot go to a university in the United States, a university in the United States presumably also governed by the Lord Spiritual, as you are, in which Mr. Baldwin is not the toast of the town. You cannot go to a university of the United States in which practically all other problems of public policy are preempted by the primary policy of concern for the Negro. I challenge you to name me another civilization, anytime, anywhere in the history of the world, in which the problems of a minority, which have been showing considerable material and political advancement, is as much a subject of dramatic concern as it is in the United States. Let me just say finally, ladies and gentlemen, this. There is no instant cure for the race problem in America. And anybody who tells you that there is a charlatan and ultimately a boring man. Boring precisely because he is then speaking in the kind of abstractions that do not relate to the human experience. The trouble in America where the Negro community is concerned is a very complicated one. I urge those of you who have an actual rather than a purely ideologized interest in the problem to read the book Beyond the Melting Pot by Professor Glaser, also co-author of The Lonely Crowd, a prominent Jewish intellectual, who points to the fact that the situation in America where the Negroes are concerned is extremely complex as a result of an unfortunate conjunction of two factors. One is the dreadful efforts to perpetuate discrimination by many individual American citizens as a result of their lack of that final and ultimate concern which some people are truly trying to agitate. The other is as a result of the failure of the Negro community itself to make certain exertions which were made by other minority groups during the American experience. If you can stand a statistic not of my own making, let me give you one which Professor Glaser considers as relevant. He says, for instance, in 1900, there were 3,500 Negro doctors in America. In 1960, there were 3,900, an increase in 400. Is this because there were no opportunities, as has been suggested by Mr. Haycock and also by Mr. Baldwin implicitly? No, says Professor Glaser. There are a great many medical schools who are by no means practice discrimination, who are anxious to receive and to train Negro doctors. There are scholarships available to put them through, but in fact that particular energy, which he remarks was so noticeable in the Jewish community and to a certain and lesser extent in the Italian-Irish community, for some reason is not there. We should focus on the necessity to animate this particular energy, but he comes to the conclusion, which strikes me as plausible, that the people who can best do it, who can do it most effectively, are Negroes themselves. Let me conclude by reminding you, ladies and gentlemen, that where the Negro is concerned, the danger, as far as I can see at this moment, is that they will seek to reach out for some sort of radical solutions on the basis of which the true problem is obscured. They have done a great deal to focus on the fact of white discrimination against the Negroes. They have done a great deal to agitate a moral concern, but where, in fact, do they go now? They seem to be slipping, if you will read carefully, for instance, the words of Mr. Bayard Rustin, towards some sort of a Procrustean formulation which ends up less urging the advancement of the Negro than the regression of the white people. 14 times as many people in New York City born of Negroes are illegitimate as of whites. This is a problem. How shall we address it? By seeking out laws that encourage illegitimacy in white people? This, unfortunately, tends to be the rhetorical momentum that some of their arguments are taking.
One thing you might do, Mr. Buckley, is let them vote in Mississippi.
I agree. I agree. I couldn't agree with you more, and for except lest I appear too ingratiating, which is hardly my objective here tonight. I think actually what is wrong in Mississippi, sir, is not that not enough Negroes are voting, but that too many white people are voting. Booker T. Washington said that the important thing where Negroes are concerned is not that they hold public office, but that they be prepared to hold public office. Not that they vote, but that they be prepared to vote. What are we going to do with the Negroes, having taught the Negroes in Mississippi to despise Barnett, Ross Barnett? Shall we then teach them to emulate their cousins in Harlem and adore Adam Clayton Powell, Jr.? It is much more complicated, sir, than simply the question of giving them the vote. If I were myself a constituent of the community of Mississippi at this moment, what I would do is vote to lift the standards of the vote so as to disqualify 65% of the white people who are presently voting. Not simply to give the... I say then that what we need is a considerable amount of frankness that acknowledges that there are two sets of difficulties. The difficulties of the white person who acts as white people and brown people and black people do all over the world to protect their own vested interests, who have, as all of the races in the entire world have, and suffer from a kind of a racial narcissism which tends always to convert every contingency into such a way as to maximize their own power. That, yes, we must do. But we must also reach through to the Negro people and tell them that their best chances are in a mobile society. And the most mobile society in the world today, my friends, is the United States of America. The most mobile society of the United States in the world is the United States of America, and it is precisely that mobility which will give opportunities to the Negroes which they must be encouraged to take. But they must not, in the course of their ordeal, be encouraged to adopt the kind of cynicism, the kind of despair, the kind of iconoclasm that is urged upon them by Mr. Baldwin in his recent works. Because of one thing, I can tell you, I believe with absolute authority, that where the United States is concerned, if it ever becomes a confrontation between a continuation of our own sort of idealism, the private stock of which, granted, like most people in the world, we tend to lavish only every now and then on public enterprises, reserving it so often for our own irritations and pleasures. But the fundamental friend of the Negro people in the United States is the good nature, and is the generosity, and is the good wishes, is the decency, the fundamental decency that do lie at the reserves of the spirit of the American people. These must not be laughed at, and under no circumstances must they be laughed at, and under no circumstances must America be addressed and told that the only alternative to the status quo is to overthrow that civilization which we consider to be the faith of our fathers, the faith indeed of your fathers. This is what must animate whatever meliorism must come, because if it does finally come to a confrontation, a radical confrontation between giving up what we understand to be the best features of the American way of life, which at that level is indistinguishable, so far as I can see, from the European way of life, then we will fight the issue. And we will fight the issue not only in the Cambridge Union, but we will fight it as you were once recently called to do, on beaches and on hills and on mountains and on landing grounds. And we will be convinced that just as you won the war against a particular threat to civilization, you were nevertheless waging a war in favor of and for the benefit of Germans, your own enemies, just as we are convinced that if it should ever come to that kind of a confrontation, our own determination to win the struggle will be a determination to wage a war not only for whites, but also for Negroes.
Buckley's rhetorical strategy rested on several pillars: historical precedent, selective invocation of black leaders, appeals to white sensibilities, and an implicit defense of gradualism. His approach was intellectually rigorous, but ultimately hollow in its ability to counter Baldwin's moral indictment of American racism. Historical and ideological context. Buckley's speech took place at a time when the civil rights movement was at its peak, with landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 having recently passed. His task was to argue that the American dream was not inherently exploitative toward black Americans, but was instead a system that, if engaged properly, could provide uplift. He strategically referenced figures like Booker T. Washington, whose philosophy of self-reliance and accommodationist politics contrasted with the more radical activism of the time. However, this use of Washington was both anachronistic and misleading, as it ignored Washington's own critiques of systemic barriers to black advancement. Reframing the issue: white disenfranchisement versus black disenfranchisement. One of Buckley's most provocative arguments was that the real issue in Mississippi was not that too few black Americans were voting, but that too many white people were. This rhetorical move was designed to appear radical while subtly shifting the focus away from the disenfranchisement of black citizens and onto the supposed problem of unqualified white voters. By doing so, Buckley attempted to deflect from the systemic voter suppression faced by black Americans, presenting the issue as a broader concern about democracy rather than racial injustice. However, this argument was disingenuous, as it failed to acknowledge that the barriers to black suffrage were not merely about voter education but were deliberately constructed mechanisms of white supremacy. The myth of American mobility. Buckley's speech repeatedly emphasized America's status as the most mobile society in the world, suggesting that black Americans could achieve success if they simply took advantage of available opportunities. This argument ignored the structural realities of segregation, redlining, employment discrimination, and police violence that actively impeded black economic and social mobility. By framing mobility as an individual responsibility rather than a systemic issue, Buckley sidestepped the core of Baldwin's argument that the American dream was built on black exploitation and exclusion. Despite his confident delivery and intellectual dexterity, Buckley's arguments ultimately fell flat for several reasons. 1. The weight of Baldwin's moral authority. James Baldwin's speech was not merely an intellectual exercise, it was a powerful moral indictment of America's racial history. Baldwin spoke from lived experience, articulating the pain and suffering of black Americans with a visceral clarity that Buckley's abstract theorizing could not match. The audience was not simply engaging in an academic debate, but was confronted with the raw reality of systemic injustice. Baldwin's ability to make the oppression of black Americans immediate and undeniable left Buckley in the position of defending an indefensible status quo. To Buckley's misuse of historical figures, Buckley's selective invocation of Booker T. Washington ignored the fact that Washington's accommodationist stance was widely contested even in his own time. More importantly, Buckley's argument failed to engage with more contemporary black intellectuals and activists who had long moved beyond Washington's framework. By relying on outdated paradigms, Buckley alienated his audience who recognized the urgency of the present moment. 3. The fallacy of gradualism. One of Buckley's core arguments was that black Americans needed to be prepared to vote and hold office rather than simply demanding rights. This is a classic example of the gradualist fallacy, which has historically been used to delay civil rights progress. This argument assumes that the oppressed must meet an arbitrary standard before being deemed worthy of full participation in society, a notion that directly contradicts the principles of democracy. The audience, well aware of the long history of white resistance to black enfranchisement, was unconvinced by Buckley's call for patience, for the overestimation of white benevolence. Buckley's defense of white America hinged on an assertion that the good nature, generosity, and decency of white Americans would ultimately ensure justice for black citizens. This argument ignored the fact that racial progress in the U.S. had historically been achieved not through white benevolence, but through black struggle, resistance, and activism. Civil rights victories were won through direct action, legal battles, and mass mobilization, not by waiting for white America to recognize its own moral failings. The audience likely saw through Buckley's idealized vision of American goodwill as an inadequate response to Baldwin's powerful critique. The final vote, 544 in favor of Baldwin's motion and 164 against, was not just a rejection of William F. Buckley Jr.'s argument, but a decisive acknowledgement of the painful realities that Baldwin laid bare. This overwhelming verdict exposed the fundamental flaw in Buckley's defense. While he was a masterful rhetorician and an influential conservative thinker, his arguments ultimately crumbled under the weight of lived experience, historical truth, and moral clarity. His eloquent appeals to gradualism, personal responsibility, and the supposed generosity of white America failed to mask the deep and systemic injustices that had defined black life for centuries. Buckley's approach, rooted in a belief that American institutions, despite their flaws, were fundamentally just, was part of a larger conservative strategy to deflect, delay, and derail demands for racial equality. His failure to persuade the Cambridge Union was not just a personal defeat, but a broader indictment of the conservative ideology that sought to rationalize and justify racial inequality in America. He sought to frame racism as an individual moral failing rather than a deeply entrenched system of oppression. In doing so, he ignored the undeniable historical realities: the legacy of slavery, the brutal disenfranchisement of black voters, the economic exclusion of black communities, and the violent resistance to integration. The significance of this debate extended far beyond the halls of Cambridge. It was a microcosm of the global struggle for racial justice. For black Americans, Baldwin's victory symbolized a growing global recognition of their plight. His words echoed the frustrations, pain, and aspirations of millions who had been silenced for too long. The debate was not just an academic exercise, it was a battle for the moral legitimacy of the civil rights movement. By overwhelmingly siding with Baldwin, the Cambridge audience reinforced the urgency of the black freedom struggle, affirming that the American dream, as it stood, was indeed built on the backs of black labor, black suffering, and black exclusion for the wider colored majority across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The debate underscored a universal truth: the struggle against white supremacy was not confined to the United States. Baldwin's speech resonated deeply with formerly colonized nations and oppressed peoples worldwide, many of whom were still fighting against the lingering structures of imperialism, economic exploitation, and racial subjugation. Buckley's defense of American exceptionalism and gradual reform sounded eerily similar to the justifications used by colonial powers to maintain control over black and brown populations. His argument was not just about America, it was about the global status quo that privileged white power while dismissing the struggles of the oppressed. At a time when African nations were emerging from colonial rule, when apartheid gripped South Africa, and when racial minorities in Britain and Europe faced discrimination, Baldwin's words offered a language of resistance that transcended borders. He linked the American Negro's plight to the broader global reality that racial injustice was not an isolated phenomenon but a systemic, interconnected oppression that needed to be confronted head-on. His argument was a call to action, not just for black Americans, but for every person of color who had been denied dignity, equality, and justice. The Cambridge debate was more than just an academic contest, it was a turning point in the intellectual battle over race and justice. Baldwin's victory symbolized a shift in the moral consciousness of the Western world, a recognition that racial injustice was not just a minor flaw in an otherwise great society but a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the American dream. It was a call to action that would echo in the struggles of the coming decades, in the fight against apartheid, in the battle for affirmative action, in the demand for reparations, and in the continuing movement for black lives. Yet, even as history has vindicated Baldwin, Buckley's brand of argument has not disappeared. Today, we still hear echoes of his reasoning in debates about systemic racism, in the dismissive responses to calls for police reform, in the reluctance to acknowledge historical injustices. The defeat of Buckley's argument at Cambridge reminds us that intellectual defenses of inequality, no matter how sophisticated, will always collapse under the weight of truth. The question that Baldwin raised, whether the American dream comes at the expense of black lives, remains as relevant today as it was in 1965. And just as in that debate hall, history will continue to side with those who dare to tell the truth.